All right, I'm going live with this. Let me switch over here a little bit. Let me know if, yeah, just speak up in chat if you're getting the video. You can see it. Let me know, since obviously I'm not going to be getting feedback from everyone audibly. So if you can say something in chat, that would be great. Awesome. All right, I'm going to give it a couple minutes before we really get going today, and it's going to be a little different than never tried this before, so I'm going to be looking for a lot of feedback, both during and afterwards, how it went, how the remote class or remote option was, whether or not there was too much delay. There'll probably be a fair bit of that. I'm just waiting for responses or input. And also, if anybody has any good suggestions about ways to improve it, make it better, speak up during class or afterwards. There's going to be some times during class today where there'll be just pauses where I'm looking for feedback. I'm looking for you guys to chat and interact, so that you can do that through Slack, because there'll be some exercises. So if you don't already have the Cloud9 immediate REPL environment up, or the Chrome DevTools would work as well, get one of those environments up and ready to go, because I want to do some hands-on exercises. That'll be a real challenge remote, because I won't get to see you guys and hear what's going on, but I think it'll be more effective for you to do some of that stuff hands-on anyways. And then if we need to, when we have the in-person class again on Thursday, we can go over some of that stuff again and just review and make sure everyone was up to speed with it. All right, I think I'll really get going. Start with the actual material I want to cover at 7:05. So just a couple minutes. I mean, I can see the chat on the side of this, but then I don't get to see anything else. So all I get to see is either the Slack or chat, but not my slides. I wanted to use my personal computer, so I actually have Slack up on my other computer, so I'll be able to see Slack even when I have the slides up presenting to you guys on this computer. So that's why Slack is going to be the best way to communicate during this class. All right, give it just another minute or so. Are there any questions that people have so far over the material? We didn't really cover a lot in the last class. We just got started with types and some variables, but hello. All right, I'll take that as no questions so far. I also don't know how long this is going to go. Probably will go a little faster since we're not in person. That if you need me to slow down, let me know as well. So first thing I want to do is just do a little bit of a review of the stuff that we covered last class. In the last class, we started talking about types in JavaScript and how types exist in, for the most part, any programming language. There's different types. And we introduced two of the types that exist in JavaScript. People want to just throw in the chat if you remember what the two different types are that we learned about in the last class. Yep. Those are the two types that we learned about so far. We've got numbers, and those are anything that's a numeric value. So that's 5 or 3.141592 or negative 42. All of those are going to be numbers. And we used, even though we haven't really gotten into the concept of operators or functions, if you will, we use this type of operator to see what the types are. And it prints out a string, hence the quotes around it of the type. So a string of number. And then we also learned about just simple strings. We learned that you can actually also have a number in a string, but it doesn't change its type. The thing that distinguishes a string is the quotes. A string can actually be double or single quoted. It doesn't matter which way you quote it, although it might be useful to use one or the other when you're typing out a string. An example when it might be useful is, let's say you have a contraction in a string and you're saying, don't jump on the bed. It's useful to use double quotes in this string because we already have a single quote, and if we just tried to use single quotes, here, I'll do the correct one and we'll see that it's fine. But if we tried single quotes, it won't know where the string ends correctly because it thinks it ends where that first single quote follows after the start, and it sees the rest of this as an invalid bit of code. So in that sense, double quotes is a little bit easier to work with because you're less likely to put them inside of your string. Later on, we'll get into the concept of how we can escape quotes or deal with things like that happen in your string. We don't need to touch on it just yet. We also talked about simple operators. So we can do addition. And those operators actually change the way that they work if you're working with strings or numbers. We didn't get into it too much, but we touched a little bit. If you're doing strings, it actually concatenates the strings together. So hello plus world produces a new string with both those strings put together. And you can even put numbers in the middle of that because it will do sort of convert them. And we'll get into that a little more today as well. Then we talked about variables, and that's what we're going to start off this class with. We're going to dig into variables a fair bit more just so that we have the basic word. Let's, hello, and we can store our hello world string inside of there. And we can get it back out just by typing it out, and that'll return the value that's in that variable for us. We can use pretty much anything for variable names. That's what we're going to talk about in just a moment. But the standard way to declare a variable is using the var keyword. Var, think of it as short for variable. There are a couple newer ways to declare variables in the new versions of JavaScript. We're going to stick with var at the start of this class and near the end, or maybe in the next section. After this intro section, we'll talk about some of the other ways and why they exist and the variance between them. So let's get into talking about variables a little more today. One of the first things that you really need to be clear about when you're working with variables is the difference between declaring a variable and assigning a value to a variable. On this line we have right here where we did var hello equals hello world, we are both declaring the variable and assigning a value to it in one line. So we're sort of doing two steps at once. Here's the declaration portion, this first half here, var hello, and then the equals hello world, that's assigning a value into it. If we didn't do that, so let's say we're going to create another variable. We'll call it the answer. And that's all we're going to do on this line is declare the variable. So now, if we tried to reference foo, we'll see foo is not defined, right? We didn't declare a variable named foo. But if I try to reference the answer, I get back a different answer, which is a little confusing because it says undefined here. It's a little confusing. That's an actual value. It's not the same thing as this error that we got before, this reference error. And that's because we have declared the answer. We just haven't put any sort of value into it yet. So since I'm a fan of Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, I'm going to go ahead and put a value into this, and it's just going to be 42. And so now that's the assignment portion of working with a variable. And you can split those two portions up if you need to for some reason. You can declare it and you can assign it separately. Usually, most of the time, you're going to work in a state where you're both assigning to the variable at the same time you're declaring it. But there are some situations where it's useful to declare it separately from assignment. We may get into some of that, but it's definitely going to be a little later because it makes sense and it has a lot of use when you're in scope and working with the concept of different scopes of code. Any questions or anything so far? If you're doing good, you can just throw a thumbs up or something like that in there. And keep moving along, but I'm happy to move back to any of these topics if people do have questions. So if there's anything that's unclear when I move on bit by bit, just let me know. The next thing that you need to know about variables in JavaScript is that they're case sensitive. That just means that I have the answer, which exists, but if I tried the answer, it's a reference error because I haven't declared that variable. That also means you can declare variables that are spelled the same, but have different cases, and they'll have different values in them. So make sure that you're paying attention to that when you're working with your variables. It's a common mistake to not pay attention to the case and miss the fact that, oh, this one had a different case and I have a missed reference in there. You'll notice I did some weird casing here where I put my two words together for this and I uppercase the second word. That's known as camel casing. It's just one way to name your variables. And the reason you do that is because spaces aren't allowed in variable names. So like the answer, that's not a valid variable name because that space breaks up what would be the variable name and causes some issues with it. So you need to put all of your characters together, and it's pretty common to use that camel case notation in JavaScript. Some other languages or other things will use different notations. For example, using an underscore is frequently referred to as snake casing. That's popular in some languages. But JavaScript, I would say camel case is the predominant way of casing. And so you'll see me do most of my variables using camel casing. All right, next section on variables is what are actual valid and invalid variable names. For the most part, there's a lot of stuff that are valid, and there's very few restrictions on variable names. However, some of the restrictions, and this one isn't quite true. I put it up here because you should just stick with these as what you start your variable names with, and you shouldn't move outside of this. But variable names must begin with a letter, the $, or an underscore. So you can't say var that's not a valid variable name because it's not starting with a letter, it's starting with a number. But you could do And that is a valid variable name. So that's one of the most basic rules. The next is, once you're past the first character, you can contain letters, digits, underscores, and dollar signs. So valid variable name, again, is like, that's a valid variable name because it's not the first character. Now, you're not usually going to put numbers in your variable names. That's not very common, but it's possible. The next one that will get you much more likely is reserved words cannot be used as names. And what that means is any word that JavaScript has reserved for some reason, usually it's because it's a keyword in the language. You can't use that as a variable name on its own, or else you're going to have problems. So that includes this list of keywords. And you can always look this up if you get stuck. But you'll notice that some of the stuff that we've already used are in there. We've got var. We've got type of. That should be expected. Those are the things that you can't use because those have special meaning in JavaScript, hence keyword. And if you tried to use as a variable name, it could be confusing to the rest of the code. It wouldn't know how to parse that code. Now I'll be posting these lesson notes after we're done, and that will include a link to this page. But there's also some other areas that it's just generally a good idea to avoid for variable names. And this page lists some of those as well. So that includes ones that are used in some of the scopes where you write JavaScript, such as a browser. It just includes some where it could be very confusing using those as variable names. So useful to have a list like that for reference, although once you get used to what are keywords, you're probably not going to run into it very often as a challenge. And then last thing, and remember I said it wasn't quite true that your variables have to begin with a letter, dollar sign, or underscore. That used to be true. They have broadened it a little bit. So also in the links for these lecture notes, I'm going to include a link to this JavaScript variable name validator that somebody wrote up a while back. And this it's just a very simple website. They even explain how they wrote it, although it's very complex under the covers. So if you want to try and dig into that, you can, but there's a lot of very delicate parsing of the specification of the language going on. But this will just validate any variable name that you try and enter and tell you whether or not it's a valid variable name. So you'll notice this one doesn't begin with a letter, dollar sign, or an underscore. It begins with some other weird character that's maybe a letter in a different language or a different font. I'm not sure exactly what that is, but that there's a valid variable name. And then when I send this out and you have questions about it, you could always play around, right? You could try and see that that's not valid, but hello 42 is fine. And you'll find that if you ever have questions like this, there's a lot of these tools that exist online. You know, when you're struggling with any aspect of a programming language, it can be useful to just check. Do a Google search. Do any sort of search online. Play around with the terms a little bit. And a lot of times you'll run across something like this that's going to help you out. All right. Any questions about variable names? There we go. Perfect. Somebody already took the link, so people have access to it already. I love that. So the next variable type the next type we're gonna get into is what's known as a Boolean. And there's only two possible values for a Boolean type. That's true and false. So if we did type of true, it'll tell you that it's Boolean, and the same for false. Now, you might be wondering, what are these Boolean types used for, or why do we have a Boolean type if you haven't written in another programming language? And that's really one of the most powerful fundamental aspects of programming, because it allows us to do a whole bunch of conditional things. And we can start with something really simple, which is a Boolean comparison operator. So we've already seen some operators like plus, minus, divide, multiply, the standard operators. And those are going to end up returning types based off whatever type you put in. A Boolean comparison operator is going to return a Boolean value based off of what you put into it. And the standard set of Boolean comparison operators are this double equals, and I need to update my notes just a second. These don't belong here. Let's go farther down. Let's see if it picked that up. There we go. So the standard set of Boolean comparison operators are double equals, less than or equal to, greater than or equal to, and not equal to. And these are all pretty much direct mappings to the concepts that you'd be used to in math if you've worked with any of that stuff. The one that's a little different is this double equals. And the reason that that is your operator is because we are already using the single equals for a specific meaning. Does anybody remember what that single equals purpose is? Because we've just gone over it just a moment ago. I'll give people a moment to answer, and I'll see if anybody is able to pull that out. In the meantime, we'll talk about these comparison operators and how they work. And I'll just throw some examples up here, and then we'll do a little bit of hands-on to work through some other stuff. Yeah, that's right. Single equals is used for assignment. And so we can't use it for comparison as well because it wouldn't know whether it was, it sounds like it's not a problem if you're doing like 5 equals 5 because you can't assign into 5. But if you're using a variable, the answer equals my other variant of it that I did, like the answer, that would assign the value of this variable into this variable. So we need a way to distinguish between them. And that's why the double equals is what is used. So working with these, they're really simple to work with for the most part. 5 equals 5, all right, easy to do. Does 5 equal 6? False. So it's just a pretty basic Boolean comparison operator. And then is 5 less than 4? That's false, but 5 is greater than 4. And equal, the less than or equal to and greater than or equal to are sort of the same. And you can also just do the not, like 5 is not equal to 4. That's true. But is 5 not equal to 5? That's false because it is 5. Boolean comparison operators can also be used with things that aren't numbers. You can compare strings, for example. I have hello. Let me create, here, I'll just compare that. And stuff doesn't all have to be a direct item. So I can compare hello to hello world. And it's going to see that they're true. And that's because it's comparing these two strings to each other and checking and seeing if all the characters are the same between them. And at first, it looks at the hello variable and figures out, okay, what's the actual string in there? So if I compared it to just the string hello, that's going to be false because it's essentially reducing it to hello world equals hello, which isn't going to be true. All right. There's no questions about just how that works. Then I'm going to move down and give you guys some hands-on time with working with through these Boolean expressions. So open up a REPL. That can be the Cloud9 one, the immediate execution environment. If you run Node on there, wherever you want to run these, but run each one of these lines in a REPL environment and just check and see what the result is from running each one of these lines. And then if any of them are different than what you expected or a little bit of a surprise, go ahead and throw a comment up in the chat, and we're going to talk about why some of that might be in just a few minutes. So I'll give like 3 minutes for you to work through this so people can get some stuff up. And let me just set a timer. But please post questions or anything that's weird about what you're seeing into chat while you're working on this, because I expect some people to be a little puzzled by some of the results. Oh, let me, thank you. Yeah, let me bring the list back up. I wasn't thinking there, the fact that you guys didn't have that. I'm going to go ahead and change it since I can't show these at the same time easily. So what I want is just when you're done working through them, instead of just setting a straight timer, just say that you were done in the chat. And when I've seen a few people go ahead and post that they finished working through it, then we're going to talk about what we encountered. I've got to work better anyways. All right, looks like Oscar was done. Did anything surprise you about the results that you got? I don't know if you're already familiar with JavaScript or not, but there's some of them to me that if I wasn't already familiar, would be unexpected. All right, surprised that true does not equal true. True equals 1. Yep. That's a good one. All right. I'm starting to see some people who have finished working through these. So I'm going to scroll up on here a little bit because I think those first ones are self-explanatory. That was just more practice of putting some stuff into the REPL for those first few. And let's start looking at this 0 equals 0 and 0 equals quoted 0 and talk about what's going on. So 0 equals 0. That's true. That's to be expected. 0 equals quoted 0 being true. Now, to me, that's surprising because we just compared a number to a string and it said that they're the same. Now, for us, it's pretty easy to see that those are the same things, or at least they seem like the same thing, but they're actually stored in the computer very differently. A number is stored different from the way a string is stored. And then you can see that it's the same either way. It's associative, it doesn't change. And then we can also get down into true equals true. So now the interesting thing is if this 0 as a number equals 0, the string is true, why isn't true the Boolean equal to true the string? What's going on here? And then the 1 and the 0 I put in there to try and push a little bit. That has less to do with the concept that we're going to talk about and more to do with the fact that historically true and false have been represented. Somebody said binary. That's pretty close to the right answer. Is historically in programming languages, true and false have actually been represented as 0s and 1s. And the concept of them being these binary values has been something that's sort of over the top of the 0 and 1 to make it easier to read and work with. That's not true in JavaScript. In JavaScript, they really are binary values. They're not just 0 and 1. But in order to maintain that same behavior, the same way that a lot of other languages have worked, 0 and 1 still represent true and false. But what is interesting is true is equal to 1. In some programming languages, any non-zero number is true. But that's not true in JavaScript. It's only the case that 1 is. And false is only double equals to 0 in JavaScript. So what we're encountering on this the 0 number equals 0 string is what's known as type coercion. So in the double equals variant of this, or if we did, for example, not equals, 1 does not equal 1, that's false because it's using it's the same thing. It's actually coercing one of the variables to the same type as the other variable. In this case, I believe it's coercing the string into a number. And so it ends up actually comparing 1 does not equal 1 when it's all done, which is going to be false. But it's doing that behind the scenes, where it's converting that type to the other type. And that can lead to some tricky issues down the road when type coercion is happening and you didn't expect it to happen. It can also lead to some very tricky behavior even now, where let me see if I can produce something that will be confusing. I don't know if this is going to work. Oops. I tried to assign it instead of compare it. Now that one should be really confusing to people. And that's some of the weird stuff that can happen with type coercion. We don't have to go into the background of what's actually happening here, but in case you want to know, it's looking at this 0xf, and it's converting that. It's saying, reading this as a decimal number, and then converting it as a hex into a decimal number, and f as a hex number is the equivalent of 15 in decimal. But there's a reason that JavaScript does that, and that's sort of try and be nice and help you out, but it can also be a challenge when you're dealing with that. And so we've got a couple other comparison operators that exist that don't do any type coercion. So these are just niceties built on top of it. You'll see some people say that you should always use the non-coercing comparison operators. I don't think that you always have to use them, but it's usually a good idea because it's going to help you not get caught up making mistakes where you compared two different types and it came out with a different result than you expected as a result. So here, if you use this double equals or triple equals variants of them, then you're going to get different results because it actually compares both the type and the value. So a 0 is a number, it doesn't equal 0 as a string. 1 is a number, can't equal 1 as a string, so not equals is true. Let me know if that makes sense or if you want any more clarification on it. We'll have another exercise in just a minute where you're working through just more hands-on with Boolean operators or comparison operators. So hopefully that'll help clarify some stuff around this. And type coercion is one of those just tricky JavaScript things that you have to get used to. But if you put these two groups together, that's the general collection of operators that you have for Boolean comparison. You've got your type coercing ones and the ones that aren't going to do any coercion. So the next category of operators that we have are Boolean logical operators. These aren't comparisons because they're not directly comparing two things. They're applying a logical operation across two different things. And the three that we have here are and, which in code is actually 2 ampersands, or, which is 2 of this pipe character, if you will. If you're not familiar with where that's at on your keyboard, you haven't programmed before, you may not have used it very much. It's right above your enter key. I'm checking both my keyboards. On a lot of keyboards, it'll be shown as this double dash. On a Mac, it's a single line. And then not is a bang or an exclamation mark. And these, let me jump down here a little bit. We'll be working through some more Boolean comparison stuff in a moment. But really the best way to work through these Boolean logical expressions, because there's only a few possible combinations of them, is to just try out what happens with each combination and what result you get. So you can use it with just straight Booleans. So if you're looking at the and, both of the statements on it have to be true for the expression as a whole to be true. So true and true is going to be true. But these other three options, true and false is going to be false, false and true is going to be false, and false is going to be false, because it's saying and. Both of these have to be true, this and this, in order for this whole expression to be true. The or operator is a little bit of the opposite of that, the inverse of that, where instead only one of the two has to be true. So if you have true or true, it's going to be true because the first portion was true. It doesn't matter what the second half is. So true or false is true. And then false or true is going to be true because it looks at the first portion, it sees that it's false, says, okay, I have to evaluate the second half. That's true. So the whole statement is true. And it's only false when it's false or false. And then not is literally just the opposite of whatever you put in, and you put it right in front of whatever you're evaluating. Now, in this case, we used Boolean values directly for this, but you can do the same thing with, for example, numbers or something else. So if we did the little weird 42 and 42, yeah, I'm not going to get into the details of why that's what you got back right now. We'll get into that. We'll talk about using other things other than Booleans in just a little while, because you really need a statement to wrap that in to do what you're trying to do with that. So let's go back up. Let's do another hands-on set of exercises. And let's just work through these different Boolean comparison operators. Go ahead and put these into your console. And as you get through it, again, just let me know that you're done working through this, or if you have any problems or anything was different than what you expected, let me know as well. And before you actually put any of them in, I recommend you pause for a second, look at it, and try and take a guess as to what you think the answer is going to be on them. That way you're exercising your own understanding of the language and how it works before you put it into the language, and it will help you refine how you understand the language. Oh yeah, where's the or symbol on the keyboard? Let me pull something up real fast. I'm sure I can find a good example. So usually, this looks good. The or symbol is this one right up here between your backspace and your return key. And it's this sort of, it's what's called a pipe in programming jargon a lot of times, or a vertical line. Good question, right? When you have these characters that you never use in other typing, it's hard to realize where you need to go for some of that. So I appreciate you asking that. So yeah, just take a little bit of time, work through these. Let me know when you're done working through these. Thanks for chiming in there, Matt. I appreciate it. It's a great answer. And it looks like, based off the material I had planned for today, we're probably going to be done a little early. Just, I'm guessing, because I'm not in person, so I can't get questions directly from people and try and answer them. I hope people are okay with that. I do have some hands-on small little programs for you to work for homework that I'll be posting later tonight. None of them are that challenging in terms of a whole bunch of complexity right now, but I might add a few more that are going to push you a little bit from what I have on it right now. Awesome. Starting to see people be done. Were any of them, did any of them give different results than you expected? Were all of them pretty straightforward? I can start typing through some of these as well. Start working through some of these. Yeah, 5, that's a good one. I put that in there. This 5 is less than or equal to 5.0. That's one that might trip you up if you're familiar with other programming languages, because in some programming languages, integers, which are just whole numbers, are different from floating point numbers. So anything with a decimal value. But in JavaScript, they're the same thing. So it's going to see those as equivalent. That could get somebody tripped up, but it's much more likely to trip someone up who's experienced in a programming language. Some of these have some basic order of operation logic attached to them. So this 3 times 1 minus 1 equals 1 plus 1. There could be some order of operation things that could throw you on the way that works, because you need to think about the order. Usually, I would just recommend, if anything's ever going to confuse you when you're actually writing code, don't try and figure out what the order is. The easiest thing you can use is just parentheses, which will group an expression and say, evaluate this as an expression. So then you could say something more like 3 times 1 minus 1 equals 1 plus 1. And that just makes it easier to know how it's evaluating. That's just like algebra or something, right? You do everything inside of those parentheses at one point. 5 equals 5 is true. And that's because it's coercing the types. Again, it sees a number and a string, but it converts the string to a number of 5. But when we did the triple equals, sure enough, it's false because it doesn't convert the types. So it sees 2 different types, and it already knows that it's not going to be equivalent. And hello is false. Hello is less than 5 is also false. Well, that's interesting then. Are they the same? So neither of them are less than the other, and they're not the same. That's an interesting result. I'm just going to let that one hang out for a little while. Not necessarily going to answer it directly, but that's not what I probably would have expected for that one. So let me see what I have here. All right. I think I'm going to make this more of a homework item instead of having you guys work this one in class remotely, because I think it's a little challenging to work. This next one that I've got, which is sort of combining some of the Boolean comparison operators and Boolean logical operators and variables and whatnot. I'll just pull that into the homework for the first exercise. So I think the next thing I want to talk about is, I'm going to step back for a second and talk about working with files, and then we're going to talk about how we use some of this Boolean logic. So I'll just create a file here and be really basic. I'm going to do say hi.js. The extension doesn't matter, but JS just stands for JavaScript, so it's what we usually name something as. And I just want to go over some possible things that you might encounter when you're working with a file, just to get a little practice with some of this. Because part of your homework is going to be creating a whole bunch of files as you work through things. So the first thing is we can already execute this file if we want to. I'm going to exit my node here. And I'm just going to run say hi.js with node. And it runs, but it doesn't print anything. So it does something really, really simple. Now, if I want to print something, if you remember the statement that we use to print something to the screen inside of a file like this, is this console.log statement. And then what I want to do is save my file again. I usually put a new line at the end of every one of my files. It's habit. So once I've saved my file after my changes, and even Cloud9, you'll see the same thing as I'm seeing here. You'll see a dot on your file if it's not saved. That indicates, keep an eye out for that if you're not seeing what you want to see on the line. And then we can run it again. And we go ahead and see our output. And everything works. We're good to go. Feeling good. But something that's definitely going to happen, especially as you're learning, is you're going to have a typo. So in this case, I never terminated my string. And since I didn't terminate my string, the code isn't really going to know when to stop trying to parse a string. And if I try and run this, this is what an error looks like when you're running one of your files. Or this is at least a syntax error of some kind or a programming error in your file. This is going to happen to you quite frequently, and you see a whole bunch of information down here about what went wrong, which none of that, for the most part, down here under this is going to be useful to you right now. Instead, what you should look at are a couple things when you encounter an error. You should look at the message that it gives you. What type of error did you get? In this case, oh, it's a syntax error, invalid or unexpected token. Sure. And then it will tell you where it saw the error as well. Now, this isn't guaranteed to be the place in the code where the error is. It may crop up several lines farther down in the code than where you actually produce the error or put the error. But this is telling you, oh, the error is in the say hi file on line 1. And it even helps highlight what it thinks is the error here. So that helps me jump up here and go, okay, what's going on? What's wrong with my file? Oh, yeah, sure enough, I didn't end my string. I'll go ahead and make that change. I'll save it. And I'll run this again. And there we go. We're working, right? And that may seem a little silly for me to be showing you what it's like to encounter an error, but this is going to happen to you all the time, and you need to get comfortable with learning how to spend a little bit of time looking at what's going on there and trying to parse it out and understand what you're doing. So in this case, let's say I've decided, oh, I want to take this and put it in a variable instead, right? Except I'm going to screw up again, and I'm going to try and I'm putting it in a hello message variable, but I didn't actually declare it. So let's see what happens in this case. If you look at this error, you'll notice it's different than before, right? It tells me that the error is a reference error. Hello message is not defined. Now that's very descriptive. That helps me out a ton in terms of what I'm actually trying to solve, which is nice because this actually tells me that the error is here on line 3, and that is where the error occurs when it tries to reference hello message. But in reality, where I made my mistake, or where I didn't think through everything, was I didn't create hello message here. So if that was a long way apart, you had 20, 30 lines of code in between those two, it may not be quite as easy to recognize, oh yeah, I messed something up on the line right above it. And that's the type of situation where you have to be able to parse through more than just the line it tells you the problem is on, because it might actually be farther up. Maybe you missed something. Maybe I had a typo up above, and I thought I declared the variable, but I didn't. You have to look out for those sorts of errors when you're working on these files. You're going to encounter them. So don't get discouraged when you have an error like that, and just try and get used to it, and get used to really reading those messages that come through as well. Any questions about anything so far? Everything going smoothly? Again, let me know if you're with me. In the meantime, while I'm waiting to hear back from people, I'll go ahead and move on to the last section of material I wanted to cover tonight, which is, let's go ahead and start putting some of this Boolean logic to use somewhere. And what we're going to do there is we're going to use a conditional statement to change the flow of our code. So far, any code that we've written has flowed, like, for example, if we went back to this say hi file, and let's say I put a lot more stuff in here. I included some math. Now I'm going to do some string concatenation here. You'll see me pushing the boundary at times about what I've shown you, because there's just too many topics and concepts to cover piece by piece. So sometimes I'll be just using some things in code that are right on the edge of what you guys have learned. Try and figure it out, but also feel free to ask questions when that happens. So I'm going to do this even more complicated. Put some parentheses around here so it's a little clearer. Step back out of my node console and run my program. And there's nothing too complicated here. The one tricky bit is this is doing a type coercion from a number to a string so that it can concatenate it using these plus signs. But the one thing that any program that we have, and I put a few more lines in here just to show you that we have written so far has in common, is that they're all linear. Everything in our program runs from top to bottom, and all of the lines of code run. But that doesn't make for a very complex program, right? Let's think about anything that you want to do in code, you're probably going to need to have it make some sort of decision based off of a value. Do this versus this. And the simple way that you do that is using a conditional flow or a flow operator to handle some of that. And the one that we're going to learn about today is we're going to start with the if statement. So an if statement is really simple. I'll go ahead and start with something on just the read eval print loop right here to show you, and we'll see what happens. I'll say if true console.log this was true. And it goes ahead and prints out this was true. If I change that and I say false instead, it doesn't actually run this next statement. And that's the benefit, or that's what you get with conditional logic. So I'm going to take this and put it up into this whole program that we have, just so that it's a little clearer that it continues to run stuff afterwards. Oh, look, my development environment is nice enough to tell me this code's never going to run because if statement is false. But I don't care about that. We're going to ignore that. And we're going to run this say hi, and it never runs this, but it did evaluate this if statement. Now, if we change it and we say true, it's going to run, and it's going to print out that bit of logic that we have right there. So that's the most basic structure of an if statement. These parentheses aren't strictly needed, but it's just very, very common practice to put them around stuff so that you know exactly what you're comparing or what you're expecting there when you're working with an if statement. So in this case, we use true, but you can put any sort of comparison operator in your if statement as well. And as long as you're going to get the value out that you expect. So let's say if 4 is less than 5, console.log math works as expected, right? And that's because, remember, we'd already tested this out before. 4 less than 5, that evaluates to true. So this is saying if true, run this next statement. Jumping back over to my notes, seeing what I have here on this. I don't remember what all I have on if statements. All right. So you can also work with variables inside of your if statements, and that's where stuff really starts to get flexible. So let's do something really simple here, and you guys are going to have an assignment that's almost identical to this, so it's useful to pay attention. But let's say my age is 17, and I'm going to have an if statement that says if age is less than 18, you can't vote. And it goes ahead and prints that out because that's a true statement right now. And now if I want to change that, so let's just say I make age 21, and I'm going to run this same if statement. I'm going to have to rewrite it, I think. Now it didn't print out anything, and that's because it evaluates to false instead of true. Are there any questions so far on an if statement? So I've been writing these if statements out on one line here, and I haven't been using what's known as brackets around them. And I'm only doing that to show you the basics of it. But a lot of times you're going to want to, really, I would just say it's best practice to always put brackets around it, but they're not necessary if you only have one expression after your if statement, because it'll evaluate that expression. So if you want to have one logical statement and you want to group multiple things, like let's say I want to print out multiple things based off of this logic. So I'm going to say if age is greater than or equal to 18, then you can put your code inside of these curly braces and that's going to run everything inside of the curly braces. And it's really just a good idea to always use curly braces on your if statements. So in this case, let's do a couple things. Now we can put one thing in there, or if we wanted it to be more complex, we can have more than one statement in there. You can also change some of your other stuff inside of there. So if you want to reassign a variable inside of your if block, you can do that. Really, you can do any sort of logic that you want inside of this block. And that's what braces surround. So anything inside of braces, that's called a block of code. Just double checking what I have here. All right, so I've got one last thing to talk about in regards to if statements. And this one, I want you guys to work through some hands-on problems. I don't really like what I have down here for my what I call truthy and falsy stuff. So instead, I'm going to let me update these a little bit. I just didn't get around to it yet. And then I'm going to have you guys work through some of these and just practice them and tell me what's happening, and then we'll talk about what you're seeing. All right, let me get rid of some of these others. Back over here. Let's see if this worked. There we go. Scroll this down a little bit. Now, why don't you go ahead and you can put these in a program if you want. So you could write a file and then just execute that file. Or you could do these inside of the read eval print loop, the REPL line. But why don't you go ahead and run these, and then again, standard procedure. When you're done with that, just say done. And if you have any questions or anything is strange to you, it's not expected behavior, post about that too, because that'll help us get into our last topic, and then we'll be done for the night. All right, I'm starting to see some people work through it. So let's ask this of the people who have already worked through this so far. What was the result of an empty string? Was it false? Was it true? Yep. So for those of you who haven't finished working through it, definitely keep at it. I'm going to go ahead and start talking about what we're seeing here. And it's a little misleading for me to say false or true because JavaScript has this weird, loose concept of falsy and truthy. And that's what we're seeing here. And some of that only shows up inside of something like an if statement that requires a Boolean. That's why I didn't just do direct comparison, and if statements are a much easier way to work with this. But I'll go ahead. I think that's because only did double equal or triple equals. So an empty string is what's known as falsy. 0, I believe, is also falsy. So we can test this. I'm just going to go ahead and straight up cut and paste these bits. See what happens. It tells me 0 is false. And remember, one thing that was interesting before was the only number that was equal to true was 1. But here we did a check and we said if 42, and it went ahead and printed the information inside of there. So does that mean 42 is true? True doesn't equal 42. No. That's because these fall into this loose realm of the falsy and truthy statements in JavaScript. And it involves some concepts or some types that we haven't yet encountered. But basically, if the value of something isn't false, 0 is a number, an empty string, null, undefined, or this other special type that stands for not a number, then it's truthy. And here's a good list on the Mozilla website of a bunch of different truthy statements. So you can see that all of these different numbers and all of this string, those all evaluate to truthy. And this is really, really useful to be able to rely on falsy and truthy behavior of some of this stuff, because it's nice to be able to write something like if 42, not quite as directly. A lot of times you'll be using a variable name in place of that. It's really nice to be able to write logic like that and not have to always convert it into a Boolean to be able to work with them. But it will also trip you up at some point when you don't realize that, oh, I did put an empty string into that to start with, and now I'm trying to compare against it, and it's still not giving me what I want. That's because the empty string is falsy. It's not going to evaluate to true. It's not a truthy type statement. So some of your homework and stuff will continue to work through this concept, but definitely what I would encourage you to do is just Google JavaScript falsy and truthy. You're going to get articles that dive really, really deep into some of this stuff, probably deeper than you're able to understand right now. But there'll also be some that are much more basic that can just explain the concept of falsy and truthy and how it applies in the language in general. But I think the best thing we've got from today, a quick recap, is we really focused on Booleans. We talked about Boolean comparison operators, Boolean logical operators. These are ways for us to compare values and get a Boolean out, or to check and see if a couple statements are both true and false. And that's another place where this truthy or falsy comes into play. Because if we did, let me double check and see if this works out. Oh yeah, hold on. I want to put that in an if statement because it's a little confusing why you see that as the result. So if I did if 42 and 50, now I want to always use braces now so that I get you guys in the good habit of always using them. Because both of those are truthy, when it does this Boolean logical operator, the whole thing evaluates the truthy as well, and it goes ahead and prints out. These are the types of situations where you'd be using it a fair bit in your code. So we covered Boolean as a type. We covered Boolean comparison operators, Boolean logical operators, and then we got into the if statement as well, which is going to allow us to change the flow of our code so that it's not just linear, moving straight from top to bottom all the time. We'll be able to change the direction or change the bits of code that run as it runs through a program. I'll go ahead and give it just another minute or so in case anybody has any questions. If I don't get any questions posted in the next minute or so, then we'll go ahead and call this class done for the night. I'll end the stream, and then probably it'll be a little while as I'm still refining some of the homework bits. I'll try and get the homework out sometime tonight as well. Also, please give me feedback on how this worked being remote. Did it move too fast, too slow? Was the audio level consistent or all over the place? Anything else on the same vein? All right, keep posting stuff, but I didn't see any questions come in. So I'm going to go ahead and end the stream, and have a good evening, everyone.